Gwendolyn Brooks is one of the most highly regarded, influential, and widely read poets of 20th century American poetry. She was a much honored poet, even in her lifetime, with the distinction of being the first black author to win the Pulitzer Prize. She was also poetry consultant to the Library of Congress, the first black woman to hold that position, and poet laureate of the state of Illinois. Many of Brooks' works display a political consciousness, especially those from the 1960s and later, with several of her poems reflecting the civil rights activism of that period. Her body of work gave her, according to critic George E. Kent, a unique position in American letters. Not only has she combined a strong commitment to racial identity and equality with a mastery of poetic techniques, but she has also managed to bridge the gap between the academic poets of her generation in the 1940s and the black militant writers of the 60s. Brooks was born in Topeka, Kansas, but her family moved to Chicago when she was young. Her father was a janitor who had hoped to become a doctor. Her mother was a school teacher and classically trained pianist. They were supportive of their daughter's passion for reading and writing. Brooks was 13 when her first published poem, Eventide, appeared in American Childhood. By the time she was 17, she was publishing poems frequently in the Chicago Defender, a newspaper serving Chicago's African American population. After attending junior, her poems in A Street in Bronzeville and the Pulitzer Prize winning poem Annie Ellen were devoted to small, carefully celebrated terse portraits of black American poor, commented Richard K. Barksdale in Modern Black Poets, a collection of critical essays. Brooks once described her style as folksy narrative, but she varied her forms using verse, free verse, sonnets, and other models. Several critics welcomed Brooks as a new voice in poetry. Fellow poet Rolfe Humphreys wrote in the New York Times Book Review that we have in A Street in Bronzeville a good book and a real poet, while Sarah Saturday Review of Literature contributor Star Nelson called that volume a work of art and a poignant social document. In Allie Ellen, which follows the experience of a black girl as she grows into adulthood, Brooks married social issues, especially around gender, with experimentation. One section of the book is an epic poem, the Aeneid, a play on the Aeneid. Langston Hughes, in a review of Annie Ellen for Voices, remarked that the people and poems in Gwendolyn Brooks' book are alive, reaching, and very much of today. In the 1950s, Brooks published her first and only novel, Maud Martha, which details its title character's life in short vignettes. Maud suffers prejudice not only from white people but also from lighter skinned African Americans, something that mirrored Brooks' experience. Eventually, Maud takes a stand for her own dignity by turning her back on a patronizing, racist store clerk. One way of looking at the book, then, commented Harry B. Shaw, is a war with people's concepts of beauty. In a Black World review, Annette Oliver Shantz noted the way in which Brooks does not specify traits, niceties, or assets for members of the black community to acquire in order to attain their just rights. So, this is not a novel to inspire social advancement on the part of fellow blacks, nor does it say, be poor, black, and happy. The message is to accept the challenge of being human and to assert humanness with urgency. Brooks' later work took on politics more overtly, displaying what National Observer contributor Bruce Cook termed an intense awareness of the problems of color and justice. Tony Cade Bambara reported in the New York Times Book Review that at the age of 50, something happened to Brooks, a something most certainly in evidence in the Mecca, written in 1968, and subsequent works, a new movement and energy, intensity, richness, power of statement, and a new stripped, lean, compressed style, a change of style prompted by a change of mind. This shift or change is often depicted as the result of Brooks' attendance at a gathering of black writers at Fisk University in 1967. However, recent scholars such as Evie Shockley and Cheryl Clark challenge the idea that Brooks' career can be so neatly divided. Clark, for example, has described In the Mecca as Brooks' final seminar on the Western lyric. Brooks herself noted that the poets at Fisk were committed to writing as blacks, about blacks, and for a black audience. If many of her earlier poems had fulfilled this aim, it was not due to conscious intent, she said, but from this time forward, Brooks thought of herself as an African determined not to compromise social comment for the sake of technical proficiency. Although In the Mecca and Brooks's subsequent works have been characterized as possessing what a Virginia Quarterly Review critic called raw power and roughness, several commentators emphasized that these poems are neither bitter nor vengeful. Instead, according to Cook, they are more about bitterness than bitter in themselves. Essayist Charles Israel suggested that in the Mecca's title poem, what, for example, shows a deepening of Brooks's concern with social problems. A mother has lost a small daughter in the Black Long Ghetto tenement, the Mecca. The long poem traces her steps through the building, revealing her neighbors to be indifferent or insulated by their personal obsessions. In the Mecca is the most complex and intriguing book. It seeks to balance the sordid realities of urban life with an imaginative process of reconciliation and redemption. Other poems in the book, occasioned by the death of Malcolm X or the dedication of a mural of black heroes painted on a Chicago slum building, express Brooks's commitment to her community's awareness of themselves as a political as well as cultural identity. In 1970s, she chose Dudley Randall's Broadside Press to publish her poetry collection, Riot, Family Pictures, Aloneness, Aurora, Beckonings, and Report from One Part, the first volume of her autobiography. She edited two poetry collections, a Broadside Treasury and Jump Bad, a new Chicago anthology for the Detroit area press. Brooks was the first writer to read in Broadside's original Poets Theatre series and was also the first poet to read in the second opening of the series when the press was revived under new ownership in 1988. Brooks, however, felt that Riot, Family Pictures, Beckonings, and other books brought out by black publishers were given only brief notice by critics of the literary establishment because they did not wish to encourage black publishers. Her later poems continue to deal with political subjects and figures such as South African activist Winnie Mandela, the one-time wife of anti-apartheid leader and later president of the country, Nelson Mandela. Brooks once told interviewer George Stavros, I want to write poems that will be non-compromising. I don't want to stop a concern with words, doing good jobs, which has always been a concern of mine, but I want to write poems that will be meaningful, things that will touch them. Brooks's works was objective about human nature, several reviewers observed. Janet Overmyer noted in the Christian Science Monitor that Brooks's particular outstanding genius is her unsentimental regard and respect for all human beings. She neither foolishly pities nor condemns, she creates. Overmyer continued, from a poet's craft bursts a whole gallery of wholly alive persons, preening, squabbling, loving, weeping. Many a novelist cannot do so well in 10 times the space. Little John maintained that Brooks achieves this effect through a high degree of artistic control, further relating, the words, lines, and arrangements have been worked and worked and worked again into poised exactness, the unexpected apt metaphor, the mock colloquial aside, amid jeweled phrases, the half ironic repetitions, she knows it all. More important, Brooks's objective treatment of issues such as poverty and racism, it produces genuine emotional tension, the critic wrote. Among Brooks' major prose works are her 2 volumes of autobiography. When Report from One Part was published, some reviewers expressed disappointment that it did not provide the level of personal detail or the insight into black literature that they had expected. They wanted a list of domestic spats, remarked Brooks. Bambara noted that it is not a sustained dramatic narrative for the nosy, being neither the confessions of a private woman or a usual sort of mahogany desk memoir public personages inflict upon the populace at the first sign of cardiac. It documents the growth of Brooks. Other critics praised the book for explaining the poet's new orientation toward her racial heritage and her role as a poet. In a passage she presented again in later books as a definitive statement, Brooks wrote, I, who have gone the gamut from an almost angry rejection of my dark skin by some of my brainwashed brothers and sisters to a surprised queenhood in the new black sun, am qualified to enter at least the kindergarten of new consciousness now. New consciousness and trudge toward progress. I have hopes for myself. I know now that I'm essentially an essential African in occupancy here because of an indeed peculiar institution. I know that black fellow feeling must be the black man's encyclopedic primer. I know that the black and white integration concept, which is the mind of some beaming early saint, was a dainty spinning dream, has wound down to farce. I know that the black emphasis must not be against white, but for black. In the conference that counts, whose date may be the 1980 or 2020, there will be no looking up nor looking down. In the future, she envisioned the profound and frequent shaking of hands, which in Africa is so important, the shaking of hands in warmth and strength and union.